Bob Woodward has a new book. He alleges former President Donald Trump secretly kept in touch with Russian President Vladimir Putin even after Donald Trump left office. The two have spoken as many as 7 times since he left the White House, all while Donald Trump was pressuring Republicans in Congress to block military aid to Ukraine. NBC News has not independently confirmed the new details laid out in that book, but that is what Woodward is writing. Joining us now, New York Times chief White House correspondent and MSNBC political analyst Peter Baker and NBC News correspondent Vaughn Hilliard. So, Peter, I'm going to begin with you. Lay out what Woodward says Donald Trump was doing with these phone calls.
Yeah, so Woodward in his new book, it's called War, and it's coming out next week, says that a Trump aide told him that he was outside of the former president's Mar-a-Lago office earlier this year, and they'd been kicked out of the office because the former president said he was taking a call with Vladimir Putin, and that this aide told Woodward that it was one of a number of such calls, perhaps as many as 7. Now, there aren't any more details about it than that, and Woodward doesn't cite any other sources, and we haven't confirmed that separately either. But obviously, if this is the case, it adds a new wrinkle to the controversy over former President Trump's relationship with President Putin, which has always been the subject of a great deal of mystery and confusion and criticism.
Peter, I think my mic's on now. Do we know the time frame for when these calls were taking place? I just mentioned it in relation to Donald Trump lobbying Republicans not to give Ukraine money. Was it around that same time?
Woodward doesn't say. He says the one call he specifically references took place in early 2024, and that's as specific as it gets in the book. So we don't have any dates for any of the other calls. If there were, in fact, other calls, we can't, therefore, time them to say, aha, this took place when the House was voting X or Y. But clearly, it raises questions because Trump has said repeatedly that Putin is a genius, that he can solve the war in less than 24 hours, even before Inauguration Day if he's elected, and essentially has said he doesn't really seem to care too much whether Ukraine wins. The terms he and his running mate have seemed to focus on as a possible negotiating basis for a peace deal would involve Russia keeping all of the land in Ukraine that it is illegally seized by force, and Ukraine giving up any hopes of joining NATO and declaring its neutrality, giving a guarantee, in effect, to Russia. Those are, of course, terms that Putin would certainly like. Again, we don't know, what took place, if anything in these conversations that might have taken place between Trump and Putin, but it raises new questions.
Yeah, and there were, the Russia investigation, Vaughn, was very much about the very many contacts that seemed to be between Donald Trump's campaign and Russia and Vladimir Putin and his orbit as well. There's also a little bit in this book about a COVID test. This is during the height of the pandemic, the beginnings of the pandemic, when COVID tests were in short supply. What is Woodward alleging?
Right. Again, this has to do with Vladimir Putin. And while Donald Trump was still president, Bob Woodward writes that Vladimir Putin, who did not go and travel abroad for 19 months, was highly concerned about contracting the virus himself. And in conversations with Donald Trump, the current Republican president of the United States, went on to, as Bob Woodward writes, secretly sent Putin a bunch of Abbott point-of-care COVID test machines for his personal use as the virus spread rapidly through Russia, to which Putin told Trump, quote, please don't tell anybody you sent these to me, which Trump replied, quote, I don't care, fine, to which then Putin responded, no, I don't want you to tell anybody because people will get mad at you, not me. They don't care about me. Again, this really goes into detail about the relationship between these two men. I did reach out to 3 Trump campaign officials here over the last several hours about specifically whether Donald Trump has had any conversations with Putin since leaving the White House in 2021. We have not heard back from the campaign about that.
That's interesting. You'd think that if there was no contact, they would have said this is all untrue. They've never spoken to each other since Donald Trump left the White House. Maybe they still will do that. Do we know a little bit more about the sourcing around? I mean, that's some pretty verbatim dialogue that Woodward is putting into his book. Do you have more about the sourcing on that? Right.
It's a Trump aide is the sourcing of this here. We don't know who that aide is. But of course, Donald Trump has kept quite an insular circle around him ever since heading to Mar-a-Lago in 2021. There was a great number of people that left his side, thinking that he did not have a political future here. At the same time, we know that Donald Trump has continued to engage in conversations with other foreign leaders and other diplomats. And, of course, there's concern potentially about the violation of the Logan Act, which is to prevent private citizens from influencing improperly U.S. foreign policy. Of course, Michael Flynn was national security advisor to Donald Trump in February of 2017. He resigned after it was revealed that he had back-channel conversations with the Russians during the transition here. So there's a long, deep, complex history. But we know when Zelensky was meeting with Trump just a little over a week ago, of course, Donald Trump was asked about what could this deal potentially look like. And publicly, he has stayed away from trying to publicly negotiate the deal. But it's not clear to what extent privately is Donald Trump trying to influence this potential situation.
It would matter very much if he was having conversations with Vladimir Putin while he was out of office. It would matter very much. Vaughn Hilliard, Peter Baker, gentlemen, thank you very much.
You know you have a problem when even your allies feel like they need to save you from yourself. Case in point, Donald Trump and the Fox News hosts who keep throwing him lifelines. Here was Trump with Laura Ingraham last night talking about political retribution.
How will you restore faith in our justice system? A lot of people will say, well, he's just going to do to them what they did to him and get back at them. And
a lot of people say that's what should happen.
Well,
you want to know the truth.
Right. Well, but I think, punitively using government institutions is what got us in this mess in the first place. And our town hall that we did back in February, one of the lines that really resonated, I think, with people is when you said, my revenge is going to be my success.
Yeah, well, I do believe that, but I will say this, they have started a terrible precedent.
You can almost see the pain in Laura Ingraham's eyes as she tries to cajole Trump into saying that he won't seek retribution against his political enemies. It is largely an unsuccessful effort until Trump says something ambiguous enough to not sound entirely unhinged. This was not the first time a Fox News host tried and basically failed to get Donald Trump to denounce political retribution. Remember this moment with Sean Hannity?
Under no circumstances, you are promising America tonight you would never abuse power as retribution against anybody.
Except for day one.
Except
Look,
what?
he's going crazy. Except for day one.
Meaning?
I want to close the border, and I want to drill,
that's
drill,
not
drill.
That's not retribution.
I'm going to be, he keeps, we love this guy. He says, you're not going to be a dictator, are you? I said, no, other than day one.
Joining me now is Michael Schmidt, New York Times investigative reporter, who has some reporting this evening about the efforts Trump made while president to seek political retribution. Michael, can you talk a little bit about how the past may be precedent?
Well, this is all sort of talked about as like, if he comes back, then this is what could happen. But it already happened. And it happened in a greater, more substantial way than even I, someone who's covered this issue, appreciated. When we went back and we looked at what Trump wanted, what he said publicly or tried to put pressure on the Justice Department privately, and what actually happened, for at least 10 individuals, the powers of the government that Trump wanted sicked on them actually were used against them.
And that included, not just the Department of Justice, which we've largely seen as weaponized under Trump, but the IRS. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So Andrew McCabe and Jim Comey, the two people who ran the FBI when the Russia investigation was open, who Donald Trump had fired, he fired Comey and he pushed for McCabe to be fired, were both the subjects of the same highly unusual, invasive audit. This is an audit that just a few thousand Americans are picked to undergo a year. It's called an autopsy without the benefit of death. and these two individuals were chosen from it. And in the months after we learned that behind closed doors in 2018, Trump was going to John Kelly saying, we really need to get the IRS on Jim Comey and Andy McCabe and other FBI officials. Now, the IRS Inspector General has cleared it of wrongdoing, but it's very difficult as a reporter to sort of avert your gaze from a fact like that when you have a president who not only wanted to weaponize the government, but certainly on the Justice Department and FBI side, oftentimes had these people investigated.
You have reporting of the White House counsel Don McGahn really trying to talk Trump off the ledge in terms of retribution. And then these lawyers in the White House making note of the efforts they had employed to stop the president from weaponizing the government so that if, you know, something actually happened, they would have a written record of the ways in which they tried to basically uphold the Constitution.
When we published a story on this, we ran thousands and thousands of words from draft memos that were of a memo that was ultimately given to Trump about why he should not use the powers of government against his enemies. We were able to see those memos because lawyers in the White House smuggled them off the White House complex in the weeks after the memo was given to Trump because they were so concerned about Trump, what Trump was going to do. This was not in late 2020 that this happened. This was in 2018.
Wow.
So there was a deep concern in 2018 that he was going to weaponize the government. And obviously, there's an even more unshackled Trump in the final weeks of his presidency.
And potentially, I mean, shackles are not even in existence if there's a second term.
Ever heard the saying, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes? Keep that in mind as we witness natural disasters disrupting the normal churn of a presidential campaign in its final weeks, and as we witness Donald Trump's response and reaction to hurricanes that are right now putting millions of lives, millions of American lives in danger as we come on the air. Faced with a crisis where, again, life and death decisions are being made, a crisis that requires more than just a partisan political response, one that requires real trusted leadership. Donald Trump continues to act like someone who has stewed in his own lies and delusion for so long that he's incapable of telling the truth, even when lives are on the line. Just last night, he claimed that there was not a single emergency worker on the ground helping people impacted by Hurricane Helene.
How would you do it differently?
I'd have a tremendous team of people here. They don't have any people here. The people are all, I was in North Carolina yesterday. I was in Georgia. And Georgia's different. You have a good governor. He's doing a very good job. But North Carolina is a disaster. And it was also hit very hard. But they don't have the people. And they're complaining there's no people around to help.
So, not true. It's not a thing. But make no mistake, those lies that Trump is telling are hurting people, actual people. They're having an impact. Here's North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper responding on Morning Joe.
This swirling vortex of disinformation is beginning to affect people there on the ground. I had an officer come up to me and say, why are they saying we aren't doing anything? In fact, this is demoralizing to all of the people who are working so hard. Those first responders who went into people's homes and pulled them out of windows in swirling waters, people who are working around the clock to get oxygen bottles and insulin to people in the remote, rugged areas of the mountains. The people who are working to get the power back on. We've gone from 1 million to about 140,000 power outages. People who are working to restore communications and water systems. And you're also making some people wary of applying for aid and relief because you have these crazy stories about FEMA coming in and taking people's land and stopping donations from coming in.
Now, one North Carolina official told Politico today this, quote, the scale of the misinformation and simply the number of posts and the eyeballs that each of those posts are being given online, particularly on X. That's what's different and truly scary, according to this official. Quote, this has felt like you're in the Thunderdome and people are just piping the noise in. They create this great confusion. It creates chaos and a crisis moment where you need people to be able to work together and come together. Now, the country has actually been right here, right where we are today, before with Donald Trump. When the moment came for, when time came for a moment where, as this official told Politico, quote, you need people to be able to work together and come together. On that issue, Trump was tested, and we all watched. and we all saw him fail. When Trump was faced with a once-in-a-century pandemic, he ignored the experts and the scientists and the models and chose instead to spread lies and disinformation and delusions because he thought it would benefit him politically to do so. Remember this.
And then I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning? I'm taking it, hydroxychloroquine. Right now, yeah. Frontline workers take it. A lot of doctors take it. I think wearing a face mask as I greet presidents, prime ministers, dictators, kings, queens, I don't know, somehow I don't see it for myself. It's a very contagious virus. It's incredible, but it's something that we have tremendous control over. What it is estimated might not come back at all, Jeff.
Now, Trump would have a hard time admitting it because he doesn't admit that he lost in 2020. But his response to the pandemic may very well have cost him his reelection. That's according to a political autopsy from his own pollster. And now, 4 years later, with 4 weeks to go before an election in this country, viewers of this program, and really anyone who's followed our nation's politics for the last few years, could be forgiven if it feels like a deja vu moment. Because the gap between what is needed in all of our leaders in a time of crisis, when life and death decisions are being made based on the information input, when all that's on the line, and what Donald Trump is offering and his indifference to the outcome, looks a lot like it did in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic. In the wake of one hurricane devastating parts of the South and another potentially historic hurricane right now barreling toward Florida, officials and scientists and experts and leaders are begging people to trust the warnings and listen to them. Florida meteorologist John Morales was overcome with emotion, describing the danger posed by Hurricane Milton.
It's just an incredible, incredible, incredible hurricane. It has dropped 50 millibars in 10 hours. I apologize. This is just horrific. Even though it is expected to weaken on approach, it is so incredibly strong right now that you're going to find it very difficult for it to be nothing less than a major hurricane when it makes landfall in Florida.
Morales will join us on this program in a couple of minutes, but we're going to start with the Acting Director of Response and Recovery for FEMA, Keith Turry. Keith, tell us what you're focused on right now and what you want people to hear and heed.
Yeah, you just heard, this is a very dangerous storm in terms of its strength and the size as it approaches landfall. The expectation is that the wind field is going to expand, and it's going to bring a range of hazards to the entire Florida peninsula, not only the storm surge, but heavy winds and rain and flooding. Some rivers are going to flood in places that they've never flooded before because the water's not going to be able to make it out to the ocean because of the storm surge. The most important thing we want everyone to know right now is they have to take preparation now, and specifically to those people that are in the mandatory evacuation areas where they're being told to evacuate, you must evacuate. Every time we go through this, there's always some people that aren't able to evacuate, and unfortunately we have a loss of life today, and now is the time to be able to take those actions and get out of those areas. We can rebuild, we can focus on recovery later, but this is the time in which actions are going to save lives.
Let me show you what the Tampa mayor, Jane Castor, had to say about the risk if people don't heed the warnings.
I can tell you right now that they may have done that in others. There's never been one like this. And this, Helene was a wake-up call. This is literally catastrophic. And I can say without any dramatization whatsoever, if you choose to stay in one of those evacuation areas, you're going to die.
How do you contend with what feels like a lack or less trust, maybe, that some portions of the population have in warnings like that? How does that impact rescue and recovery efforts?
It's obviously a significant challenge. Trust is extremely important. We need people to listen to the message that they're getting from the Weather Service, from the Hurricane Center, from their local officials, as you just heard. And when we have situations where, information is being provided that isn't accurate, it undermines the entire system and the entire credibility of what those that are trying to save lives are saying. And I just want to footstop what the mayor said there. This is not the same as the storms that they've seen in the last couple of years. The track of this storm is a scenario that we've watched for some time and understand is going to create flooding in areas that have never flooded before. 10 to 15 feet of storm surge, that is not something that you can survive. And so I just really want people not to think about the last storm and think about the neighborhoods that may have been flooded and yours might be okay. If you're in an evacuation area, you need to evacuate.
And the governor of North Carolina and other officials have talked about what is always sort of advanced operational work under the most difficult circumstances for FEMA and the FEMA workforce. But just talk about what it's like when people don't necessarily welcome or trust the FEMA people and workforce who are there to help them.
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, the men and women FEMA are some of the most dedicated civil servants in all of government. They dedicate their lives to supporting people and helping keep them safe and helping them recover on some of their worst days. They travel away from their families. They sacrifice time on their own lives. And they do that because they know what the survivors are going through is much worse than that. And so they are committed and dedicated to supporting them. When you have misinformation out there that is creating misconceptions or people are afraid that FEMA is going to take their funding, their land, or not going to give them enough resources, that can create anger and hostility, and it's just not productive to the goal that we all have, which is to save lives, help people recover, help make them comfortable, and try to get things back to normal as quickly as possible.
We begin tonight with just 4 weeks to go until Election Day. A number of states have already begun early voting, and as the candidates make their final sprint to the finish line, now is the critical time for each to get in front of as many different voters as possible to make their case. Today, Vice President Kamala Harris continued her media blitz in an effort to reach a wide variety of audiences on different platforms. This morning, she joined the ladies of The View, where she rolled out a new policy about expanding Medicare to cover the cost of long-term care at home.
To your point about being in the sandwich generation, there are so many people in our country who are right in the middle. They're taking care of their kids and they're taking care of their aging parents. And it's just almost impossible to do it all, especially if they work. We're finding that so many are then having to leave their job, which means losing a source of income, not to mention the emotional stress. And so what I am proposing is that basically what we will do is allow Medicare to cover in-home health care.
She then went on the Howard Stern show on Sirius XM, discussing an array of topics, including what she thinks this election is all about.
I do believe that this is an election that is about strength versus weakness.
Yeah.
And weakness as projected by someone who puts himself in front of the American people and does not have the strength to stand in defense of their needs, their dreams, their desires, the work that must happen to make sure that we are a secure nation, that we are nurturing and protecting our alliances around the world, that we are supporting America's military, that we are fighting to bring the cost of living down for working families, that we are building businesses, building growth.
She will also appear on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert tonight. This comes after Harris already appeared on the podcast Call Her Daddy, one of the most popular podcasts in the country, especially among women. And after appearing last night on 60 Minutes, an interview that all major party candidates for president have done for more than half a century. That is, until Donald Trump canceled last week. Among the various reasons why, according to Trump's campaign, is that 60 Minutes, a news program, would have the audacity to fact-check the interview. Here's the reality. Trump couldn't do the interview because at this point, he requires the safety of his MAGA security blanket. Yes, Trump may have done a number of interviews, but they are almost always with conservative outlets and Trump supporters. Most recently with Fox's Laura Ingraham last night and right-wing podcaster Ben Shapiro today. All Trump is doing is speaking to his base and his diehard supporters as he faces softball questions with little to no pushback or no follow-up at all, allowing him to just regurgitate alternative facts and misinformation with each breath. The two campaign strategies couldn't be more different. One is trying to reach out to diverse audiences while continuing to roll out substantial new policies. The other is remaining in his echo chamber, repeating the same debunked lies in an effort to inflame voters with his deceit. Joining me now is Fernand Demandi, Democratic pollster and MSNBC political analyst, Molly Jong-Fast, Vanity Fair special correspondent and an MSNBC contributor, and Tara Setmayer, co-founder and CEO of the Seneca Project and a former GOP comms director. My thanks to this fantastic panel. I want to start, Molly, with you. We're going to play Scott Pelley of 60 Minutes, his explanation of why Trump pulled out of that 60 Minutes interview. Take a quick listen.
The campaign offered shifting explanations. First, it complained that we would fact-check the interview. We fact-check every story. Later, Trump said he needed an apology for his interview in 2020. Trump claims correspondent Leslie Stahl said in that interview that Hunter Biden's controversial laptop came from Russia. She never said that. Trump has said his opponent doesn't do interviews because she can't handle them. He had previously declined another debate with Harris, so tonight may have been the largest audience for the candidates between now and Election Day.
I mean, Molly, that was a doozy, number one. But let's be clear. If Kamala Harris were to pull out of that 60 Minutes interview, the media would lose their minds. Many in legacy media have been super critical of Harris for not doing a lot of interviews, so they say, when in fact, the truth is Donald Trump is the one who continues to refuse to sit down with anyone who's not a friendly face. Sounds like yet another double standard.
Yeah, I mean, look, Trump is always compared to always given a pass compared to a normal candidate, right? He always gets away with stuff that a normal candidate would not necessarily. But I think what's important here about Harris and her strategy, which I think is very smart, she's going to where voters are. She's going to where the voters she needs are. So, for example, Howard Stern has a lot of white, non-college educated men. That's a demographic that she's going to. And Call Her Daddy was actually a really brilliant strategy because those are women of childbearing reproductive age largely, though older women listen to it too. And they need to know about the Project 2025 and the plans that this Republican president would enact if he were elected.
You know, Fernand, Trump refuses to do the 60 Minutes interview, complaining he's going to be fact-checked. He complained about being fact-checked at the debate. Looks like he's never going to do another debate at this point. Is it because he's just a pathological liar and can't tell the truth? Or is he just too scared to be able to be in a format or a platform where he's never going to be able to just run his mouth with impunity?
Well,
or both.
I mean, he was a pathological liar in 2016 and 2020 and has been ever since. So I'm not so sure it's that. As much, Katie, I think it is. Trump showed in that debate that there was a way to get to him, right? Which is to make these crazy kind of appeals to ego that he quickly jumps on. He also understands that if he's in any kind of what you might call a legitimate media journalistic environment where he's going to be called on the carpet for a statement he made in the past, he falls apart. And I think this is as much a campaign decision, Katie, by the Trump campaign, as it is a Trump decision.
Do you think he's listening to people on the Trump campaign telling him not to do this?
Oh, I absolutely do, because I think Trump even himself recognizes the more people see him, the more people hear him, the worse he's going to do in this campaign. So they're just trying to hide him now and see what they could do to get him across the finish line, because that debate was revelatory. It's why Kamala Harris is desperate to have additional debates and why Trump has backed out of every opportunity to go one-on-one again with Kamala Harris.
It's like his campaign is like Weekend at Bernie's getting him across that finish line in November. So, Tara, here, look, it's not just interviews. Axios did a study of how many rallies Trump has held this campaign cycle compared to 2016. And you can see it up on the screen right now. So this was back in September, and it's substantially less, even in the friendliest environments. When he has a teleprompter, a crowd of fans, and no interruptions, Trump still doesn't perform on the level he once did. And I want to emphasize the verb perform, Tara. So are his advisors, kind of to Fernand's point, telling him to limit his exposure? Or, in my opinion, I don't think the guy can do it anymore.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of both. It's clear that Donald Trump is not the same guy that he was in 2016 or even 20. He's deteriorated considerably. Even his bronzer isn't as good. So he's struggling here, and we all see it happening in the way he talks, in the way he misspeaks. He's rambling more, slurring his words more. Trump is not well, and his advisors see that. And the more that he's out there, the more people see it, and he just physically cannot do it. He tries to blame everybody else. He blamed the Secret Service. He's blaming the venues, he's blaming Democrats, he's blaming the weather, whatever, instead of the fact that he can't handle it anymore. And he is the oldest person now in this race. He does not have Joe Biden as a crutch to blame for being the one that is too old and unable to and unfit to do the job. That's why he's obsessed with constantly bringing up Joe Biden and constantly projecting about, how come they just switched him out? And yeah, because now you're the old guy and everybody can see it. It's more pronounced. And the other thing, too, about this is I don't know necessarily that he's listening to his advisors, that he understands and recognizes that he can't do it. I think that they know how to stroke his ego enough because he will never admit that he's not good enough. He'll never admit that he's failing. He'll triple and double down and say that he's the best he's ever been. He's better looking. That's why he compared himself to Kamala Harris. Remember that he's better looking than her, or whatever nonsense he was saying. He'll never admit that. Instead, they're putting him in areas where he is adored. We know that the adulation is his fuel. So they're limiting the rallies by manipulating it in a way that makes it seem as though he's in friendly territory, so he's still around people who adore him. Because I don't see how this strategy is adding voters. The more he's out there, the more people are repelled by him. And his advisors are smart enough to know that. But the other people who are the bootlickers that are just there to make him feel good about himself, they're figuring out a way to shield him so that he doesn't have to look in the mirror, literally, and see how terrible everything looks for him. And that is something that I think there's a double standard here, because we're actually talking about Kamala Harris maybe making a couple missteps during her View interview today, or she's on a media blitz because she has to have more policy. But Donald Trump has said a series of insane things over the last 5 days, including talking about bad genes for migrants and lying about hurricane disaster relief that could cost lives. But we're not talking about that. We're nitpicking Kamala Harris's policy positions. I think that has a factor also, that plays a role in this also. It's a double standard.
Joining us now with more on this, science educator Bill Nye. Bill, it's always a pleasure to see you. It's very difficult times that we're talking, you and I, about today. But Milton went from a tropical storm to a Cat 5 in just over a day. Hurricanes are nothing new, but this level of intensity is so unusual, Bill.
It's unusual and scientifically interesting, but very, very troubling. Look, my heart goes out to, our hearts go out to everybody who is affected and will be affected, not just by what's happening now, but what has happened. I mean, they're probably going to retire the names, both Helene and Milton. It's so serious. So here's the striking thing. The hurricane is coming from the southwest going to the northeast, not from the southeast going to the northwest. And it's going into a part of the Gulf of Mexico that has this extraordinary thing called the loop current. And it reminds me very much of gears spinning together, where one gear drives the other gear. And so the hurricane naturally has a counterclockwise spin in the northern hemisphere through this remarkable thing, the Coriolis effect. And then it's getting amplified by the spin of the sea right there, the Gulf of Mexico. Now, you've probably been to Clearwater, Florida. And Clearwater, Florida gets its name because of the way the sediment settles, because of the way the current spins through there. Well, this current is going to help amplify this tornado, this hurricane, and it's even going to spin off tornadoes on the outer edge. I mean, this is a very, very big storm, and the whole thing is driven by the heat of the ocean in the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, everybody's been talking about this literally for decades. Well, here it's really happening so quickly. This warm water provides all this energy to these storms, and the cool air, the relatively cool air around, drives it up. The water vapor comes out of solution as rain. The heat is released at high altitude, and this causes the spin, and the spin of the Earth causes the whole thing to go around. Now, look, Jose, you know, when it comes to things like space exploration, I do my best to be political but not partisan. Where do we apply our intellect and treasure? Right? And when we're on MSNBC, I'm very happy to be here, big fan, we are talking to people who are generally like-minded. But anybody out there who has young voters in your world, in your family, this is it, everybody. The other side, as we often call it, has no plans to address climate change, no plans for long-term dealing with these sorts of problems. If you have young voters out there, encourage them to vote. People say, what can I do about climate change? If we were talking about it, associating it with big storms like this, that would be really good. But the main thing is vote. Thank you.
And Bill, very quickly, how much of an impact do you see climate change playing in all of these explanations that you've given us? How much do you change as being a part of that?
Oh, it's no question, everybody. Look, in climate science, everybody has been studying this for years. Everybody has been commenting, scientific papers have been written about how warm the ocean is around the Florida Peninsula. And it's this warm water that is driving these storms and enabling it to have to intensify so quickly. Everybody, be careful out there. Let's get through this.
VP Harris has done a ton of interviews already this week. Today on The View, she revealed a pretty big new policy proposal, expanded Medicare to cover in-home care. It is aimed at easing the stress on the so-called sandwich generation.
I took care of my mother when she was sick. She was diagnosed with cancer. And so it is a personal experience for me as well as something I care deeply about. There are so many people in our country who are right in the middle. They're taking care of their kids and they're taking care of their aging parents. And it's just almost impossible to do it all, especially if they work. What we will do is allow Medicare to cover in-home health care.
Here to talk about it, Peter Spiegel, U.S. Managing Editor for the Financial Times, and David Gura, correspondent from Bloomberg and host of the Big Take podcast. This is big. This isn't Obamacare big, but we already have Obamacare, and there are millions of Americans, seniors, boomers, who know full well how in-home long-term care for a senior bankrupts families, destroys families. How big of a deal is this? And more importantly, do you think expanding Medicare drug price negotiations actually pays for this?
No, it's not going to pay for it in full. But this is a big sandwich, to use the metaphor of the sandwich generation. And a lot of people are dealing with this. And so Medicare as it exists now doesn't cover vision, doesn't cover hearing, doesn't cover this, which is so critical. So there are ways to get the government to pay for this. You can go through Medicaid, but a lot of people are left out, not able to get this kind of care. So I think that it does move the needle. What are the problems with it? A huge shortage of people who can do this kind of work. I think you have to acknowledge that. And then
you know who often does this kind of work?
Children.
Immigrants.
Yeah, also true.
Yes. When you think about home health care workers, a huge portion of home health care workers are immigrants. If we suddenly had a mass deportation, there'd be a problem.
I mean, yes, and the cost will go up exponentially.
Correct.
Let me argue something against you on this one, though. Please. I mean, obviously, it's really important. As David said, there's a lot of people this affects. The problem I have with the interview she did with you and this interview she did is, to me, it's all very incremental. It reminds me of sort of the second Clinton term, where they would do very popular things that were small and sure to get a certain amount of voters interested. It is not, as you say, Obamacare. It's
but
not
we don't need Obamacare. We have it.
But when you vote a president of the United States, you want a big economic vision. The Inflation Reduction Act under Biden, the NAFTA under Clinton. Presidents propose big, transformational economic change. She is doing a little bit of a tweak on Biden on tax incentives, a little bit of tweak on Biden and Medicare. She's not presenting a big, bold vision for what it is. And she had the problem on that show. When she asked, how are you different from Biden? She doesn't have an answer for that because most of what
why
she's
does she have to be? Why can't she be? Listen, she's in a difficult position because it's like she's in an improv show because she's the vice president. So it's a yes and.
Exactly.
But from a policy perspective, President Biden has had 4 massive. Okay.
No, you're 100% right. You're 100% right.
So why does she have to offer a big, giant, different thing? What he's done is working.
Despite the numbers being good, he is still hugely unpopular on the economy. Inflation has really been damaging, and all the polls show this. It is still the biggest issue, and she is not presenting a vision that you want from a president. Every Democratic president is running for
I'm going to say, okay, she's not. But you know who's offering a disastrous economic vision?
Fair enough.
The person she's running against. Mass deportations and massive tariffs are going to crush us economically.
Picking up just on the deportations piece of this, I mean, you look at the potential effects of that. Now we have studies looking at just what it would cost to implement these draconian policies. We're talking about tens to hundreds of billions of dollars for that. And that doesn't even bring to bear the fact of doing this in perpetuity or the kind of human and psychic cost that something like that would have. So you're right. It is something that clearly animates and fascinates many of his advisors, including Stephen Miller. But what you're getting at, I think, is that they haven't thought through what the knock-on effects of that would be. And just the hit to GDP alone, 2.5 percentage points, just based on that alone, is something that would so dramatically affect this economy. It would be devastating.
Not to mention, new analysis shows all of her big, you call them ish, small, I'm not going to say big or small. Her plans will raise the deficit by $3 trillion.
Yeah.
Donald Trump's by $7.5.
Yeah.
So you tell me, why does he poll better on the economy?
You got me, to be honest with you. And I'll be honest with you, in your interview and the interview she did today, what she is much better on is criticizing Trump on his economic policies. There's a lot to criticize than presenting her own vision. I just think that, and she falls back on that quite frequently. Now, why the American people do not realize...
Don't you think that's how Joe Biden got elected?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And remember, the argument you will hear consistently is if you remember pre-pandemic, and again, it's people have their blindfolds on, the economy was stronger pre-pandemic than it was under Biden. Now that is depends on what bit of the economy you were in, but there is a certain people, and it was a long time ago, who still believe this in their head that they were better off under Trump than they were under Biden. The polling shows that consistently, despite the fact we've had 4 years of strong economic growth and low unemployment, and all the numbers have been good. The inflation thing, in my mind, is just overwhelming everything else. And I still worry that she does not have a good answer for that, and that's why
because
she's not.
My love, there isn't a good answer for
particularly
it.
for the federal government. There's no role on the fiscal side in particular.
Yes, that's why. Yes. I mean, it's not like there's a great answer and she's hiding it in her pocket. There ain't one.
Yeah.
But she can say his plan's worse.
Well, again, I think she is doing well on that. I don't think she is presenting a vision for the economy that is equivalent to what Clinton, Obama, Biden did as former Democratic presidents before they went for president. Everything she's doing is sort of, as you say, sort of Biden plus. And the overwhelming concern of the American people still is inflation. They blame Biden for that and her by association.
Okay, well, then let's talk about Donald Trump, who we're saying people see as a boss. We've talked about his venture into cryptocurrency. The New York Times has done extensive digging into his partners, okay? And they found, quote, a trail of lawsuits, unpaid debt, and tax liens. How does anyone look at this and think this is not shady? How is it that we continue to hear over and over? This guy ran businesses. He's a boss. He's been a boss of businesses that have gone bankrupt and that are filled with legal issues.
It is amazing to watch as he runs for president, him getting into minting coins and making sneakers and cryptocurrency. And it is shady. And I'll tip my hat to my colleague and friend of the show, Zeke Fox, who wrote about these guys as well. And look, they have crazy backgrounds. Barron Trump is involved in this, reportedly with Martin Shkreli, trying to engineer some sort of crypto enterprise, the likes of which we don't really know what it is or what it's going to do. Again, I just am stupefied by how a major party candidate for president has the time to do all of this. He's certainly not doing any semblance of due diligence on this.
Well, okay.
I mean, it is all part of the grift, as David said. But the problem I have that I think is even worse about this thing is he used to be against cryptocurrency, but now he's in favor. Why?
Because crypto businesses are giving enormous amounts of money to his campaign, darling.
And what do you think if he ever becomes president? Who's going to be setting our tech policy, right? So this is worse than just the grift.
He is going to launch Gary Gensler into another stratosphere on Elon Musk's rocket.
Absolutely.
Let's
so
be clear.
the things that David was talking about, which is all part of the grift, right? I'm selling Bibles. Those are really unclean and terrible. And Eric Adams, this to me is worse. This to me is worse. Is exactly what you said. He's doing it purely because he can raise money from these guys, and then when he becomes president, they're all going to set tech policy, and that's going to affect all of our lives. And that is what I think is really, really dangerous about this sudden conversion to cryptocurrencies in his late life.